Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute inspiring new connections to Jewish prayer in a changing world. I'm Jessica Fisher. About a year and a half ago, my doctor told me it was unlikely that I could ever get pregnant. My spouse and I had just finished a round of IVF, and after testing all of the embryos, not one of them came back viable. The doctor couldn't explain the results. I was surprised by the ferocity of the grief that hit me. That grief bound itself up with my yearning for God's presence since October 7th and throughout the war in Gaza, at that point 8 months long. Every Shabbat, I got caught on one line of liturgy, Ki mechakim anachnu lach, because we are waiting for you, God, to show up, to take over, to fix this mess we're all in. In some ways, focusing on this phrase as the community murmured it around me accentuated my yearning. This piece of our liturgy is old, meaning our people have been longing for God's presence for thousands of years with no clearer signs of closeness to God, no matter when they were asking. But in other ways, reciting this line reminded me that I was not alone, because our people have an ancient and storied tradition of seeking God in moments of despair. And there have been so many moments of despair. On those Shabbat mornings, I hadn't been asking God for a dramatic medical intervention, just to accompany me in my sorrow. I don't think I experienced any direct response from God as a result of those prayers, nor did I expect one. But the routine of showing up, of being surrounded by people, of feeling moved by ancient texts, I think all of that helped me manage my grief. A few months later, we decided to try IVF again with another doctor. We went through the stages, retrieving eggs, fertilizing embryos, testing them, and transferring one. After the fact, I was surprised that I hadn't found myself turning to prayer. With the first cycle so ripe with possibility, we went to the mikvah where we said a prayer to begin the process, but we didn't make time for ritualizing this second attempt. For my part, I felt skeptical and emotionally distant from what we were doing. It was just a routine medical protocol of seemingly endless appointments that would either work or would not. Without the hopeful promise of our first try, I did not factor prayer or ritual in at all. This wasn't a conscious decision, but I'm sure it was reflective of my desire to just get through the process. I share all of this to surface something important. Prayer is really complicated. Sometimes praying is the perfect balm. But sometimes, even if prayer is a tool we regularly rely on, it might not show up for us in the ways we need it to. Or we might find ourselves pushing it aside in favor of other, more tangible sources of solace. If prayer isn't part of our daily lives, it can be even harder to connect with the practice in moments of pain. Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. My name is Jessica Fisher. I'm a rabbi and an educator. I live in North Carolina, and I work for the Shalom Hartman Institute. I also love to pray. I've gravitated toward prayer since I was a kid, which is probably why everyone in my life realized I would become a rabbi long before I did. But just because I'm a rabbi and I love praying doesn't mean it's simple for me. I love the poetry of our liturgy, but I don't always connect to the sentiment of each prayer or the structure of every service. I love the routine of daily prayer, but don't always have the discipline to stick with it. I love praying with other people, but don't always feel at home in many, if not most, prayer spaces. And sometimes my prayers feel more rote or distracted than sincere. And even though I like the idea of directing my prayers to God or to someone, I'm rarely confident that they go anywhere outside of my own head. I know I'm not alone in these struggles, which is why I'm excited about this show. This podcast will open up a space for these conversations with scholars and rabbis who are also real people with their own evolving and even conflicting relationship to prayer. Much of the time, when we talk about prayer in this podcast and in Jewish life, we are referring to the structured experience of engaging with an inherited liturgy, either alone or with a community. But for many people, prayer is spontaneous, intimate, and even wordless. For some, prayer is any kind of conversation between an individual and God, but for others, authentic prayer can only happen in the context of community. There are Jews who pray from a siddur, a prayer book, but there are also Jews who pray through asking questions at a Seder table, or dancing, or protesting. And of course, there are so many Jews who don't pray and who are turned off by the very idea of prayer. The podcast is called Thoughts and Prayers, in part as a playful critique of the way politicians and leaders send seemingly hollow thoughts and prayers in response to every crisis and tragedy. If everyone sends their thoughts and prayers as a matter of course, does it still mean something? And does it serve to replace, or worse, to avoid, the actual action needed in response to the event and to prevent future tragedies? Jews throughout history have asked a similar question about prayer. If I only pray because I'm supposed to, but not because I connect to it, does it still mean something? Like so many of us, Jews have long grappled with prayer, its vocabulary, its formulas and expectations, but modernity has brought its own layers of complexity. The increasing centrality of rationalism, individualism, and more often come in direct tension with the ancient, communal, and somewhat mystical technology of tefillah, of prayer. Each episode of this series will feature different voices grappling with a central question of this moment in relation to prayer. In this first episode, we are unpacking a question I hear regularly and often wonder about myself. Does prayer work? One of the hallmarks of modernity is rationalism, and so many of us are eager to find ways to understand the world. Prayer doesn't exactly fit in to a logical framework. Many of us aren't sure about our goals when we pray, or how to know our prayers have been heard, or if we even believe in God at all, let alone one who is listening to us. It can be hard to trust that reciting ancient foreign words to address an unseen, unknowable God will affect any real change in our lives, let alone the world. In this episode, we'll meet 3 different people wrestling with the efficacy of prayer from 3 different angles. We'll start by hearing from Dr. Sara Labaton telling a story about a family conflict over a prayer to find lost objects.
My grandmother called up my father frantically, and she said, "Ronnie, I lost my ring. I lost my diamond engagement ring." And my dad said, "Okay, Ma, should I come by to help you look for it?" And she said, "No. But my friend said that you could say a prayer for lost objects. So can you come to the house and say that prayer for me?" My father was a modern Orthodox rabbi, a Syrian pulpit rabbi, who prayed 3 times a day, every single day, with a minyan. He was passionate about God and halakha, but extremely wary of superstition. And he said, "Mom, you know I don't believe in that. God doesn't work that way. We pray as an expression of our relationship with God, but we don't try to manipulate God to do something for us." And she said, "No, I want my ring." And then he said, "Mom, you have your health, you have your family. Thank God." And she said, "I want my ring." Now, if my father channeled all his energy into serving God and his congregation, my grandmother channeled it differently. She was up with the birds, scrubbing her windows, and frying kibbeh. My grandmother, 101 years young, tfu, grew up in Argentina with 0 Jewish education. She may have even gotten herself expelled from Catholic school. The 2 of them respected each other, they loved each other, but she had her way of doing things, and he had his way of doing things, and now she needed his help. And you don't say no to my grandmother. So he came over to her house, and he said something, and I have no idea what he said. Of course, a few hours later, my cousin found the ring in her sugar bowl. And my grandmother said, "You see, it worked." My cousin said, "What are you talking about? I found the ring." No, my grandmother insisted. It was the prayer Uncle Ronnie said. So did the prayer work? A rationalist would say, no, it was a coincidence. A supernaturalist would say, yes, the incantation, the intonation, the intention conjured the ring. But what would it look like to critically interrogate the idea that prayer is real, it works, and that in otherness, something that defies definition is present and actively at work in the world? Nachmanides, a 13th century Spanish Jewish commentator and mystic, speaks cryptically about the idea that the performance of various mitzvot, like prayer, blessings, and rituals, can actually do something meaningful for God. Meaning God is broken and relies on human, specifically Jewish activities to make things right. With the idea that prayer activates divine energy to flow through God and into the world, Nachmanides endows people with a huge amount of power. Theurgic rituals like these not only work to maintain and strengthen God, but they also bring blessing to the earthly realm and to us. For Nachmanides, we can change God, and in doing so, we can change the world. Take a different approach to the question of prayer working. I'm a rationalist, like my father was, and I'm also a skeptic, some might even say a disbeliever. I don't pray every day. One thing I got from my father, however, and my kids now do as well, is when we're in the car and we see an ambulance go by, we say, Baruch Rofeh Cholim, blessed is the one who heals. And for me, I don't say it to try and whisper in God's ear to please heal that person. I say it as a reminder to myself. There are people in this world who are sick, who are vulnerable, perhaps in danger, and we are obligated to respond. If prayer is a way for us to focus our attention on things that matter to us, that we value, and if we have the capacity to act upon those values, then could it be doing the same work as whispering in God's ear? Nachmanides' approach to prayer reminds us that we have immense reserves of power, of capability, even tantamount to God's powers and capabilities. We can fix God and change the world. There's a Syrian custom that might offer us another insight. Before saying the Amidah, the thrice daily core Jewish prayer, we take 3 steps back from God and then 3 steps forward. And as they take those steps, Syrians gesture to one side and then to the other side. The explanation I heard for that is, before you face God, you need to have peace with your fellow human beings. Literally, those next to you, behind you, in front of you. Sometimes those are the people who annoy you the most. And yet you need to connect with them, and you need to strengthen those relationships before you can address God. My family has been somewhat of a microcosm of different practices and beliefs and ideas, always with mutual respect. Did God reveal or produce my grandmother's ring to my cousin because of the prayer my father said? I have no idea. What I do know is that saying that prayer was an opportunity for my father to honor his mother, for my grandmother to remember her late husband. So yes, I think the prayer worked. Of course, the irony doesn't escape me that when it came to our deepest, most urgent prayer, my own, my father's, and my grandmother's, God never responded, at least not the way we were hoping. My father died of cancer 15 years after his diagnosis, and a few years after this incident. And maybe that was running through my father's mind as he argued with his mother about the ring. If prayers are that easy, why am I still sick? I guess that reality serves as a reminder that there is a push and a pull with God. For all that we can do, there are limits, and for all that we know, there are mysteries.
That was Sara Labaton, Director of Teaching and Learning at the Shalom Hartman Institute. We've been exploring the tension between ancient mystical prayers and modern rationalist sensibilities. The question, does prayer work, often comes up in our most desperate moments, when many of us find ourselves turning toward or away from prayer based on our sense of the answer. For some, like Sarah's grandmother, finding the lost ring is enough to prove that prayer does work. For others, a sick loved one who doesn't recover from an illness is proof that these petitions are ineffective. While the question of whether prayer works on a metaphysical level may never be resolved, there are other ways that it does work. Sara describes praying for the lost ring as a way for her father to honor his mother and her grandmother to remember her husband. For Rabbi Josh Warshawsky, praying also works as an educational tool that can teach us how to bring ourselves and our experiences into conversation with Jewish tradition through the words codified in the Siddur and by echoing the thousands of years Jews have wrestled with prayer. Josh, it's so good to be in conversation with you.
So great to be in conversation with you.
So I wanted to just start by asking you, why was liturgy the part of Judaism you gravitated toward as an educator?
I think a lot of it just comes from my upbringing, right? It was the Jewish text that I was most familiar with because I was engaging with it at synagogue, in day school, at camp. And because of that, I familiarized myself with the words. And because I have a love of the Hebrew language, I started to figure out and understand what I thought the words were trying to say. And I was trying to figure out how to share those understandings with as many people as I could.
For you, as somebody who grew up with those things, that felt like an intuitive pathway, but you've really spent a lot of time trying to introduce it to people for whom it's not an everyday language or tool that they're encountering.
Yeah, I think that's true. The first time that I ever tried to start composing melodies for liturgy, I was a music teacher at a Hebrew school in South Orange, New Jersey. And it was my first, sort of real job when I was in college. And I realized that I was sitting and trying to engage these kids in these words of our tradition that have been there for forever, but I was struggling with finding ways to engage. And I decided to start writing melodies because I wanted to be able to capture what I thought the words were trying to say and figure out how the music that we use could help to better express the emotions that are already buried within the words.
Yeah. And how did adding melody to these ancient words, help smooth the pathway for people to access the thing that you were experiencing before putting the melodies on it?
I think one of the things that I always loved about prayer in general is that there was always music embedded within, but then there were these little lines in the middle of a paragraph that I would encounter as I was sort of scrolling my way through the murmurai, as I call them, right? If you go to a synagogue where they chant three different things, then at some point, if you have your eyes open, you might notice something that pops off the page. And so I would see some of these words and want to try and capture what a phrase was trying to say. So really the beginning for me was trying to explore particular phrases as opposed to prayer as a whole.
Yeah, it's so amazing because you're right. It really does bring it alive when you start paying attention to the different rhythms and different modes that already exist. And then obviously the tunes that you've developed have also created their own layer of additional meaning on what these prayers are trying to say.
Yeah, I think the paying attention piece is it's totally spot on, right? Often, especially if you're encountering prayer, once a day or thrice a day, right? You're not often paying attention to what it is that you're trying to say. But sitting there right in the middle of the text, right after the Baruch Hu, we have a line that says, "Uvtuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh breshit." In goodness, every single day, God renews the act of creation. But what's new when we're encountering the text every day? The words are the same. So the thing that's new is you. Right. So how are you bringing your own personal identity, your memories, your external things that are going on in your life to the words that are sitting on the page? And that's actually what's happening in prayer. Right? It's not just the words that are on the page. It's how we encounter them and how we express them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I want to take us into kind of a bigger picture view of prayer. You're picking up on how individual words or phrases within the tefillah can emerge for us as powerful and meaningful. How can either the ritual of daily prayer or those individual words of each prayer prepare us to encounter and experience our lives as we're living them? And on the flip side, what are the limitations?
Well, first of all, I think if we're trying to understand what it is that the endeavor of prayer is hoping to help us engage in, these words were crafted and put in this particular order by our original liturgists, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And they had an arc of emotion that they were trying to create. And if we can understand what the arc is trying to get at, prayer helps me be the best version of myself every single day. How does it do that? It helps me figure out, what do I need in my spiritual backpack? What do I need in my emotional backpack? What do I need in my literal backpack for everything that I'm going to encounter over the course of my day? And prayer, it begins with gratitude, the Modeh Ani prayer, saying, thank you, God, for returning my soul to me. And then it orients us in space. We say, Ma tovu ohalecha, how great are the places that I get to reside in on this particular morning or day. And then we move into feelings of joy, right? If we get to the Ashrei, which is how do I figure out what's going to make me happy today in the places where I get to be? And from there, going into noticing where I am in creation, understanding the tools at my disposal. That's like revelation. We have this Torah that's been given to us. That's a guidebook for us. How do we walk that in the world? And so if we can understand what prayer is trying to help us feel, then hopefully we can open up the thoughts and prayers within ourselves to engage in that in the best way possible. And at the same time, you also asked about the limitations of that, right? The first limitation is, for many of us, especially in the diaspora, it's in a foreign language. right? So there's already a barrier in front of us to help us open ourselves up. So how do we begin to translate that, both literally translate, but also help to get at the feelings of what's beyond those prayers? And also, some of the prayers that are set up for us in the particular order in the Siddur aren't necessarily about the things that we might be thinking or feeling about today, right? The Psalms, or the hybrid Psalms of Psukei de Zimra, our opening verses of prayer, are generally verses taken from different Psalms on particular themes. The themes that have been set up for us are like loyalty, truth, God, faith, and maybe that's not what we need every single morning, right? If we looked at all of the Psalms, 150 of them, we have every different emotion that a human being could possibly feel or express, which is why we say the last 5 Psalms every single day, as if to say, I know somewhere within this book it has something that I'm feeling. Let me pause, orient myself towards that feeling, and allow myself to just express it with my breath, right? Kol hanshama tahalaya, let my soul just express in this last moment whatever it is that I need to express today. But only if we're able to actually understand what that moment is trying to give to us.
Part of what's so powerful about where you just ended is it's so permissive, right? People often experience prayer as this very rigid thing or a stale thing where they're coming into a place and it's kind of imposed on them, or they're opening up a book and they feel like they have to follow a certain order. And you're saying, yes, you can do that and there's meaning in that, but sometimes it's really valuable to look at other places in the tradition than what's being prescribed for you in that moment, which is part of what opens it up as an educational device.
Oh, totally. And I think that in some ways that's both sort of the positive and negative of our fixed liturgy, right? The liturgy was fixed at some point in time, but before that, the Shaliach Tzibor, the prayer leader, would just say whatever prayers they were feeling in any particular moment, and the community gathered would say, Amen, right? If they agreed with those prayers or if they were feeling that. And so you've got a different prayer leader or a different moment in time, and different prayers were said. We originally codified the prayers into our Siddur so that we could literally be on the same page, and so everyone could have the opportunity to buy in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the words that we were always meant to say on any given day. So if we look at that example from the original, that hopefully gives us the permission and the ability to sort of change things up for ourselves on any given day.
Do you have an example of learning something from a prayer of some portion of the day that you've then applied to a moment in your life, or that helped open up for you a different understanding of a moment in your life?
I spent a lot of years going to a conference called Song Leader Boot Camp, which is where we spent a lot of time doing engagement with leading and prayer and music. And at one of the morning tefillah experiences, I shared a melody that I'd written for Emet Atahu Rishon Ve'atahu Acharon, which is a line in our morning liturgy right before the Michamocha prayer, all about a God of truth, a God who is there in the beginning and there at the end. Perhaps if we reinterpret it, it's about sort of this ultimate truth that's there in the beginning. And how do we find a way to have truth be something that we're lifting up throughout our entire lives? And we sang that melody together for Emet with this group of like 300 song leaders and musicians gathered, mostly from the conservative and the reform movement. And a very dear friend of mine came up to me afterwards and said, you know, those words are actually not in the reform movement's Siddur right now. They had been taken out at some point in time because that theology of sort of as God as ultimate truth didn't jive at that point with philosophy and theology of the Reform movement. And so they took out those words. And now here we are with all these people who are now singing these words again in a morning liturgy experience that they haven't sung in like 50, 70 years in a prayer experience. And what is that like to reincorporate liturgy and then refit it to the way that we actually engage with it? And that's the possibility when something is just sitting there in the Siddur. It allows us to open it up again in ways that we never might have experienced before. And to me, that was really eye-opening. Whenever I encounter something that I'm not sitting with well on a particular day, I try and think about what is it that these words originally were intended to say? And then how can I think about what I need them to say to me today? And then sometimes I leave them be. And sometimes I say, I'll come back to them again. But to me, that's sort of been an eye-opening memory that I think about often whenever I encounter something that it's not sitting with me in the way that I hoped it would.
It's such an evocative example because so often we are so tempted to just throw things out, right? This no longer suits me. I don't want it anymore. And part of what your melody did in this case was reawaken a possibility of an interpretation that hadn't been previously thought of, right? They threw it out because they couldn't imagine a way in which it would be relevant to a modern Jew's life whenever they made that decision. And then you were creating a new meaning for them.
There's actually an amazing little mini sugya in the Talmud about rabbis doing exactly this, where the words originally in the Amidah were Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, God who is great and mighty and awesome. And then at one point, I think maybe it was Jeremiah or Daniel, the prophet said, what? God isn't mighty. The people are being destroyed all the time. I'm not going to say the word mighty. And then later, the rabbis of the Great Assembly say, no, we have to say the word mighty. What does it mean for God to be mighty? It means that God conquers God's anger. And so instead of throwing something out to actually reinterpret it to mean what we hope it means in that particular moment, to call it an aspiration, it gives so much more possibility in what these words can do for us. The potential is like infinite.
Yeah. There's also something that's so reassuring to know this isn't a modern problem, right?
Oh, yeah.
Rabbis 2,000 years ago were encountering these texts and these words and feeling like, oh, actually, this doesn't completely suit my need for this moment, or it actually feels antithetical to what I believe, and trying to make a way to make it work. It's not just that these texts are really old and feel archaic to us thousands of years later, but actually even the people who were, part of designing them and setting them as our fixed liturgy also had that struggle.
Yeah, the struggle is real. The struggle is eternal. And the struggle is a part of it, right? If we're not struggling with it, then that potentially means we're not engaging with it.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
That was Josh Warshawsky, composer, educator, and rabbi of Congregation Agudas Achim in Bexley, Ohio. We may not experience prayer as having an immediate or tangible impact on our reality, but it can serve as a way to orient ourselves emotionally and spiritually. Prayer can also be a thread that ties us to Jews around the world and throughout history who have recited similar words or grappled with the ideas behind them. As Josh said, even the rabbis who laid the foundations for the prayers we recite today weren't completely sure how to create prayers that describe God or persuade God to respond. In the final segment for today's episode, Rabbi Akiva Mattenson reflects on a Talmudic text that offers another layer of prayer that goes beyond the Siddur and even beyond words. Through Akiva's analysis, we find ourselves in a shared, cross-generational conversation with ancient rabbis who, like many of us, also worried that the gates of prayer were locked and their prayers may never be answered.
Rabbi Elazar said, "Since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer have been locked. As it says, though I cry out and plead, God bars my prayer. Still, even though the gates of prayer have been locked, the gates of tears have not. As it says, listen to my prayer, God, and to my outcry give ear. You won't be deaf to my tears." Babylonian Talmud, Berachot 32b. What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. It may strike us, too, as an impious one, the sort of rumination that is out of bounds. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here, in the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar goes further than timidly questioning whether prayer works. He asserts, unabashedly, since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer have been bolted shut. There is no question in his statement. Prayer does not work. It doesn't even get past the gate. Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. It is hard to know what has happened to God. Is God inside, refusing to be in relationship? Is God away, delayed for inscrutable reasons, or because the worst has tragically happened? Whatever the case may be, Rabbi Elazar is certain that in praying, we are not speaking with God face to face, as it were. And yet, he is also certain that we pray, that we go on praying nonetheless. So what is prayer then? I'm reminded of a line from a John Ashbery poem at North Farm, a question that concludes that poem. Is it enough that the dish of milk is set out at night, that we think of him sometimes and always with mixed feelings? Prayer is a dish of milk. It is a gesture of care, a sign of love that carries no expectations, like a dish of milk lovingly left for stray cats. We pray because we care about this relationship with God, as frayed and fragile as it is. Like the dish of milk set out each night, prayer in its regularity bears witness to our faithfulness, even if it isn't always animated by a passionate belief in the possibility of renewed relationship. And like the dish of milk, prayer becomes an occasion to think of God. As we articulate God's name with our lips and address God in the second person, to think of God with mixed feelings. To pray is to negotiate the breach of our lost intimacy by insisting on the continued significance of our relationship with God. It is continuing to talk to your parent even after they are gone, as if to say that they will always be your constant companion and confidant, even if not in quite the same way. It is showing up again and again outside the door of a friend who has locked themselves in their room to tell them about your day and make clear that whatever is going on, your love for them has not dulled, and you will be waiting for them when they are ready to engage. There is beauty and comfort and fragile hope in this. To borrow from W.E.B. Du Bois, prayer may be unhopeful, but it is not hopeless. The second half of Rabbi Elazar's teaching takes a turn. Weeping, crying, says Rabbi Elazar, continues to be an open pathway to God. Before there is prayer, and before there are questions about whether prayer works and whether it arrives, before there is language and before there is knowing, there is something more basic. There is crying. We come into this world crying. To cry is to be creaturely, to be vulnerable. We often hear about the virtue of thick skin, but to see the value in tears, in crying, is to see the virtue in thin skin. To cry is to let oneself be affected by the world, to be emotionally porous and permeable. There is courage in letting the world in, especially a world that can be so painful. But Rabbi Elazar teaches, in crying, divine presence becomes possible. In tearfully letting the world in, God opens the gate and lets us in. It may be that prayer does not work, he says. But when we are tearfully and viscerally alive to the world, in pain or sorrow or laughter or joy, maybe it doesn't need to. Crying and praying, praying and crying. Rabbi Elazar imagines us doing both. The verse that ends his teaching depicts them side by side. Listen to my prayer, God, and to my outcry give ear. You won't be deaf to my tears. There is, it seems, some ongoing value to visiting the gate locked to prayers, even as the gate opened by tears beckons invitingly. And maybe this verse, by putting prayer first, suggests that there is even something amiss in striding nonchalantly through the open gate without first experiencing the impasse of the locked one. Our world isn't suffused with the possibility of divine presence, nor is it everywhere and always marked by the stubborn persistence of divine absence and inaccessibility. There are open gates and locked ones. To pray is to stay attuned to what is locked off, to what is missing and lost, to what isn't working in our world. To cry is to become attuned to all the life and divine presence that is here nonetheless. Spiritual honesty demands them both. In this teaching, Rabbi Elazar chooses the image of a locked gate. There is all the difference in the world between a locked gate and a wall. Walls are impenetrable. Locked gates can and do open. In the end, getting our prayers to reach God is not easy, but it is also not impossible. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
That was Akiva Mattenson, faculty member of the Shalom Hartman Institute and a content advisor for this podcast. We live in an irrational world. Most of the time, things just don't make sense. Our days and lives don't go the way we plan them. We lose precious rings. We offer care for the people around us without recognition. In the chaotic, unpredictable reality of our lives, prayer may seem like something we should abandon as unhelpful nonsense. But each of the people we heard from today reminded me that prayer can be something I return to again and again. Maybe praying is an irrational act because it doesn't yield concrete results, and we have no further proof of divine presence. Or maybe prayer, in whatever form it takes for us, is the most rational thing we could do, because it can anchor us, give us direction, focus our attention, and, as Josh suggested, help us pack up our spiritual backpacks for the day. There are so many locked gates and doors that we continue banging our fists against, even with no sign that they will ever open. Why should we treat the gates of prayer any differently? The voices we heard today, filled with their own doubts and hesitations, encouraged us to stick with it, to try out different modes or interpretations or beliefs, to see what can happen if we test the limits of what is rational and what is impossible. In other words, to pray.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guests Sara Labaton, Josh Warshawsky, and Akiva Mattenson. Thoughts and Prayers is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. Our content advisor is Akiva Mattenson, and our production assistant is Shannon Miller. This show is edited by Josh Allen and features theme music by Gabe Scherzer and Emet by Josh Warshawsky. Marketing by Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and additional music consulting by Josh Warshawsky. Thank you also to our contributing producer, M. Lewis Gordon, and to Dina Weiler and Gabe Scherzer for additional production assistance. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We'd like to hear from you about the show. If you'd like to share your thoughts on prayer, please write to us at thoughtsandprayers@shalomhartman.org. To keep up with Thoughts and Prayers and the Shalom Hartman Institute, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.